There is a rule that every single country on Earth follows. Not most countries, every one. Democracies follow it. Dictatorships follow it. Countries that can't agree on anything else somehow agree on this. But the strange part is, no one signed a treaty. No one held a vote. There's no international law that forces anyone to follow it. And yet, if you ask the leaders of all 195 countries why they follow this rule, not one of them could give you a real answer. But it gets weirder, because this isn't the only rule like this. There are dozens of them, invisible agreements that the entire world follows without ever deciding to. And once you see them, you'll never look at the world the same way again. Let's start with something you've never questioned. The week is 7 days long, Monday through Sunday. You've known this since you were a child. But stop and think, why 7? A year is 365 days, because that's how long Earth takes to orbit the sun. A month is roughly 30 days, because that's approximately one lunar cycle. A day is 24 hours, because that's one full rotation of the Earth. Every unit of time we use is based on something observable in nature. Except the week. 7 days doesn't correspond to anything. It's not a quarter of a lunar cycle. That's 7.4 days. It doesn't divide evenly into a year. It doesn't divide evenly into a month. The 7-day week is, mathematically speaking, completely arbitrary. And yet, virtually every civilization on Earth independently arrived at it. The Babylonians used it. The ancient Chinese used it. Indigenous cultures with zero contact with Europe used it. The Soviet Union actually tried to abolish the 7-day week in 1929. They switched to a 5-day week, then a 6-day week. Both times, society essentially rejected it, and by 1940, they went back to 7. So here's the question nobody can answer. If 7 is arbitrary, why does every human culture converge on it? There are theories. Some say it's because there are 7 visible celestial bodies. Others say it's the longest cycle humans can psychologically track without losing count. But no one actually knows. And the fact that the Soviet Union, a superpower that could reshape entire economies, couldn't override this invisible rule, that should make you uncomfortable. But the 7-day week is just the beginning. The next rule is one that every country follows right now, and it's one that has literally determined whether people live or die. Every country on Earth uses red to mean stop or danger. Red traffic lights, red stop signs, red warning labels, red emergency buttons. You've probably assumed there's some obvious reason for this. Maybe red is the most visible color, but it isn't. Yellow is actually more visible to the human eye, which is why it's used for caution. So why isn't yellow the color of stop? The real answer is complicated and partially unknown. Some historians point to early railroads in the 1830s, which used red because it was the color most associated with blood, and therefore danger. But that just pushes the question back further. Why did humans universally associate red with danger in the first place? Here's where it gets interesting. Studies on primates, monkeys and apes that have never seen a traffic light, show that they instinctively react with more caution to the color red. Dominant male mandrills have red faces. Poisonous frogs are often red. Ripe, potentially fermenting fruit is red. Some researchers believe that the association between red and stop/danger isn't cultural at all. It's embedded in our biology, possibly tens of millions of years deep. Every country uses red to mean stop, not because anyone decided it, but because our primate brains were wired for it before we were even human. And no country has ever seriously tried to change it, not one. Here's a rule so strange that most people don't believe it when they first hear it. If you step inside a foreign embassy, you are, legally, no longer in the country you're standing in. The US Embassy in Moscow is legally American soil. The Russian Embassy in Washington is legally Russian soil. This means that the host country's police cannot enter. Their laws don't fully apply inside. The embassy's country can, in theory, do whatever it wants within those walls. This isn't just a polite agreement between allies. This rule holds between countries that actively despise each other. During the Cold War, American and Soviet embassies operated under this rule while both sides had nuclear weapons pointed at each other. During active wars, embassies of enemy nations have been respected. Not always, but with shocking consistency. The rule is called diplomatic inviolability. and it comes from the Vienna Convention of 1961. But here's what most people don't realize. The Vienna Convention didn't invent this rule. It just wrote down what was already happening. Diplomatic immunity and embassy sovereignty have been practiced for thousands of years, across civilizations that had no contact with each other. Ancient Egyptian diplomats had it. Chinese dynasties honored it. It existed in West African empires, in Mesoamerica, in places that had never heard of European law. Think about what that means. Even civilizations in active conflict with each other independently decided the one place we will never attack is where the other side's messengers sleep. Why? The practical answer is that diplomacy requires trust. But the deeper question is, how did every civilization arrive at the exact same solution independently? Is there some kind of game theory inevitability to it? A rule that any intelligent civilization would eventually discover? And if so, what other inevitable rules are we following without realizing it? That question, whether some rules are inevitable, brings us to maybe the strangest example on this list. A rule that governs something you do every single day, that you've never once thought about. Every country on Earth requires you to pick a side of the road and stick to it. About 65% of the world drives on the right. About 35% drives on the left. But here's what's actually strange. No country drives in the middle. No country lets you choose. No country alternates by day of the week. Every single nation, without exception, picked a side. And nobody can fully explain why these two options exist in the first place. The common explanation is that left-hand driving comes from medieval knights who needed their right sword arm free, while right-hand driving comes from Napoleon forcing the change in his empire. But this doesn't hold up. Countries that were never part of Napoleon's empire drive on the right. Countries that had no medieval knight tradition drive on the left. The deeper pattern seems to be that humans, when organizing any bilateral system, traffic, walking down hallways, even swimming lanes and pools, will instinctively self-organize into one of two lanes. It appears to be a fundamental feature of how humans navigate shared space. And the specific side a culture picks may have more to do with which hand is dominant in that population than any historical event. But the truly unexplained part is the universality of the binary. Left or right, never three lanes, never free-for-all. Every civilization, from ancient Rome to modern Singapore, converges on a two-lane system. It's as if the rule was always there, waiting to be discovered. But there's one rule that might be the most unexplainable of all, and it has nothing to do with laws or politics. It's about music. Every human culture that has ever existed has created music. Every single one. There is no known civilization in the history of the world, past or present, isolated or connected, that didn't develop music independently. And it goes further. Virtually all human music is built on the same set of intervals: the octave, the fifth, the fourth. These intervals show up in ancient Chinese music, in Aboriginal Australian music, in Andean music, in West African music, in traditions separated by tens of thousands of years of isolation. When researchers play these intervals to people who have never been exposed to Western music, they still perceive them as consonant, as sounding right. This isn't cultural. This is something deeper. The octave is a 2-to-1 frequency ratio. The fifth is 3-to-2. These are the simplest mathematical ratios that exist in sound. And somehow, every human culture on every continent across every era found them. Not because anyone told them to, not because of trade or colonization. They found them because these ratios appear to be woven into the way our brains process sound. Every country follows this rule, every culture, every civilization, and nobody decided it. The math was just there, waiting for us. Which raises one final question. If these rules, the week, the colors, the diplomacy, the roads, the music, if none of them were decided by anyone, and all of them were discovered independently by every civilization on Earth, how many more rules are there that we're following right now that we haven't even noticed yet? If this made you see the world a little differently, you'll want to see what we cover next. Subscribe so you don't miss it.